Hello and welcome to the National Road Safety Partnership Program webinar, Understanding the Impacts of Road Trauma. I'd like to acknowledge AFMA today for helping facilitate and organising today's webinar. And for those who are part of CILTA, the Chartered Institute for Transport Logistics Australia, you actually get 5 CPD points for attending today. So let's dive on in, and we have a great webinar ahead today. So for those of you who don't know, our webinar is going to be going for 60 minutes. We have 40 minutes for discussion throughout and 20 minutes for questions, and we're going to make it nice and interactive as we move along. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jerome Carslake. I'm the Director of the National Road Safety Partnership Program, which is delivered in partnership with Monash University Accident Research Centre. And if you want to follow us, please do reach out. You can follow us on LinkedIn, social media, or sign up for our newsletter so you can be kept up to date with everything. So today, we're going to make it as interactive as possible. So we're using a thing which I guess Bernie, Chris, and myself are quite new to, using Slido to make this as interactive as possible, thanks to AFMA. So if you can please click on the webinar function, grab your phone, you can use your camera to go through and make it all happen nicely through that. So there it is, sorry. I'll just bring it up for myself. So I've got that all functioning to go. And we'll be taking questions through that as well. So over to our amazing presenters today. We have two passionate people joining us. G'day, Bernie.
Hi, Jerome. Thanks for having us.
Awesome. And welcome, Chris.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having us. Yes, it's great.
So, Bernie, would you like to give us a little bit of a brief overview of who you are?
Yep, sure. As you've said, Jerome, my name's Bernadette, or Bernie, or Bern, whatever you'd like to call me. And I am currently the CEO of Amber Community, which was formerly Road Trauma Support Services until last year. I've been with the organisation for 12 years, and my background is in social work. So I started with the organisation as the Manager of Counselling and Support Services, and was appointed CEO 4 years ago. So I'm very passionate about our amazing organisation, and yeah, I'm here to stay for a while.
Awesome. And Chris, a little bit about you, please.
My background is also in social work and came from a drug and alcohol background, but I've been with Amber Community for 17 years now, and I guess I feel very privileged to be working with, I predominantly work a lot with lived experience volunteers across the organisation, and I feel very privileged to be working with them and helping provide opportunities for them to share their experience. So yes, and like Bern, I'm here to stay because I love what I do.
Well, the fact between, was it 29 years? I did a quick calc just then. So the fact that the two of you have been there, it says a lot about the amazing culture and passion of your organisation that you're on board. So now let's dive on into the session. But before we begin, whoops, I've just jumped ahead myself a couple of times. I apologise. So before we dive on in, I'd just like everyone to just think about duty of care. We have no idea as to what you've been through, what personal things are going on in your life. And I just want you to just reflect on that. And if something does pop up or something traumatic triggers something in you, please take the time to step away. You can always come back and watch us another time, but don't put yourself on any duress. The other thing is, if you're in Melbourne, we have a magnificent day here. Use the chance afterwards to do something fantastic. Go for a walk, give yourself a hug, give someone else a hug, and just celebrate the experience of life. So I think this is a key thing to think about when we dive into today's session. So over to you, Bernie and Chris. And to start off with, why was that duty of care statement so crucial that I threw that out to start things off with?
I think it's really important, Jerome, because there's a couple of things. I think sometimes we can underestimate what we carry with us on a day-to-day basis. And like you said, we don't know what people's experiences have been. So I think that people need to prioritise their own self-care. And if they're not feeling okay, or if something triggers them, to give themselves permission to go off and have a break, go and sit outside for 5 minutes, like you say, do something that's important. Because if we continue to ignore how we respond to triggers, I think the likelihood is that we can just make things worse for ourselves.
And I guess,
sorry, Chris, some of the content, what we talk about, whilst we don't have any graphic images or anything like that today, but some of the content could trigger people.
And I was just going to add that, you know, and I guess that's what this is about. It's starting to have some conversations so that people feel comfortable about seeking support when and if it's needed.
Well, this is the thing, post-trauma care is quite often overlooked or not really taken into account quite often in the road safety space. I think it's a fantastic opportunity to put this out there and to show some of the amazing work that you guys look after in Victoria. So let's dive on in.
Thanks, Jerome. So again, thank you for having us, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Even though we can't see you, we know there's a lot of you out there. We'd like to begin today's presentation by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today. And for Chris and I, we speak from the lands of the Wurundjeri people. We recognise the continuing connections to land, waters and community, and we pay our respects to the members of all First Nations peoples and their cultures, and to elders both past and present. If anyone wants to let us know who where they're attending from today, just pop it into the Slido chat. So a warm welcome to everybody, and particularly to those people who have had a lived experience of road trauma and are joining us today. Like we've just said, please reach out if you need any support. Please feel free to ask questions. Chris and I will have our contact details on at the end of the presentations. But also, like we said, take a break if you need a break. But what we hope for today is that you all will be able to walk away with some idea, if you come from a workplace where driving is part of your work, that you'll be able to think about, how do we respond to incidences that happen on our roads? How do we support our drivers? Are we proactive rather than being reactive? So we hope you all walk away with something that's going to be useful from today. I'm trying to move through, hang on.
There we go.
So we're going to talk a little bit today at the moment, just really briefly about who we are as Amber Community. So we provide free support, information and counselling to any Victorians who have been impacted by road trauma. Our counselling and support services are funded by the TAC, but as a relatively small not-for-profit, I think we pack a big punch though. We're often looking at our fundraising to support the programs that we deliver. The majority of our referrals come through directly from Victoria Police, but people can self-refer. So you don't need a referral from a GP or anything like that to come and access our services. We've got a group of professional counsellors who have specialised and work solely in this area within this organisation. And have come to the organisation with a lot of experience. We have a really client-centred approach, so we don't work with people all the same. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. So we're really working with people to look at where they're starting from and what they're presenting with. We also have a whole stack of information on our website, and the counsellors have even more that help people navigate their way through how they've responded to a particular incident. So we see people who have lost loved ones, we see people who have been directly involved, who are injured, family, friends, colleagues, sporting clubs, communities often contact us and say, you know, this has happened in our community, how can we support the families and things like that. We also offer a range of education programs and services that are based very much on a community development model. The education team is spread right across the state, and they work closely with Chris to deliver a range of programs that aim to raise the awareness about the impact of road trauma, and also work very heavily on prevention. So looking at how can we reduce the risk of people being involved in a serious collision. Within that program, as Chris mentioned before, we have about 130 volunteers. Most of those people.
That's huge. That's a massive number. And just a quick question that popped in here, Bernie. Does Amber Community provide 24-hour support?
No, it's a really good question. No, we're not a crisis support service. And in all of our promotional material and that, we do try and make that pretty clear to people. But having said that, we'll often get a referral for someone who was involved in a crash by the very next day from Victoria Police. And usually it often takes people maybe a day or two to perhaps ring in themselves. Sometimes it's a few weeks, but no, we're not a crisis support service. So,
and I think the other thing there, Bernie, is that it can be at any time when people do seek out to get some support. It's not always straight after an incident. It might be 20, 30, 40 years post an incident where people might not have got that support, or they've been triggered by something because they hadn't thought about or didn't know about some support services that might be available.
Yeah, definitely. So there's the only prerequisite for accessing our service is that you have to have been impacted in some way, indirectly, directly. So seeing all those different cohorts of people sort of confirms that. And our lived experience people, Jerome, that you said, you know, that's a lot. It is a lot. And they're an amazing bunch of people who bravely share their stories in the hope that they can stop other people from being in their situation. So we feel incredibly honoured to work with them, and Chris and her team support them really well, because in the process of telling their story, we don't want them to be re-traumatised, and we also don't want to traumatise people who are listening to them either. So that we work really closely with them. And just finally, our two main events are our Time for Remembering service, which is held on the 3rd November of each year, in line with the Global United Nations Road Safety Awareness Day, Remembrance Day, and that's held at Queen's Hall at Parliament House. And our amazing Shine a Light on Road Safety campaign, which falls in May, which has a walk at Albert Park Lake, and you know, we usually get around 800 people there, and it's a day full of mixed emotions. There's lots of hugs and tears, but there's also lots of bright, beautiful people who come together to try and raise the community awareness about, you know, let's do something to make a difference here.
I just wanted to start with some stats before these polls, but just to give a bit of perspective to, you know, what we're talking about when we think about professional drivers, and in particular these stats are related to truck drivers. But 1 in 3 truck drivers have been the first responder in a serious road incident, and they are also likely to be the first responder more than 3 times. And when I heard that, I thought, wow, you know, we hear these stories, but to hear that stat. And then 92% of all road incidents is involving a truck, the cause of the crash is the behaviour of the driver of the passenger car. 38.7% of the fatal crashes involving a truck is a suicide. Suicide by truck is sadly becoming a phenomenon. And the last one I really wanted to point out was 80% of drivers who are the first responder at a road incident continue on their journey after. The emergency services have arrived and taken over the care of the injured. So they just keep going. So I think that really kind of highlights, you know, the importance of the discussion that we're having today. But I can see that people have actually started to talk about, put their responses into the first question that we wanted to get started with, asking if people have been impacted by road trauma either directly or indirectly. And just seeing that response.
Chris, I think you make a really interesting point there. When someone's involved in an incident or they experience it, and like you said, they just get on and they begin driving again. But what that also means is they're in the vehicle by themselves, and you're able to ruminate on that, and the thoughts can play through in your mind. Like I know I had an incident which I came across, and I did this exact same thing. I just kept on driving after I'd acted as the first responder and helped this lady out. But then you have flashbacks. You keep seeing the incident popping through. You see the damage to the person, and because you're on your own, but it is quite a powerful traumatic event.
It certainly is, and that's where it can be really when people are ready to be able to talk to somebody to get it out of your head can be a really good and sometimes often just enough of what needs to happen for that. Don't know, Bern, if you want to add to that one.
We'll talk about a little bit more about it, Jerome, in the next couple of slides about how to manage that sort of incident in your workplace, I guess, particularly, or as if you're a driver yourself, yeah.
And I guess this poll just shows, even within our audience here in this webinar, you know, there's quite a number of people that have been, you know, either directly or indirectly impacted, 66%.
2/3. And the interesting thing as well is from an impact. I was talking with a driver a while ago, and he had a near miss event. It didn't actually result in the impact, but a car was clipped, and he made eye contact with the child in the back of the car in the seat, and you could see the fear in her face and all that sort of stuff. But it was a very close, small bingle. Wasn't a big one, but he didn't drive a truck for 3 or 4 years afterwards. He could only actually go into a car, and it was a fantastic drive. He shared about it, but he said, look, we just need to all take care and share the road, because that car just made a decision. But that impact wasn't anything big or that, but it's what he saw and what he felt from it.
And I suspect, Jerome, that he may have felt and gone through all the what ifs and really got quite stuck in that place. So what if it was, you know, a few centimetres this way or that way, or I was driving faster. So trying to get those thought processes under control takes a bit of work. So I'm not surprised to hear, and I'll give you another example of an ex-client of mine a little bit down the track.
Well, let's move on to the next slide, because I think basically 2/3 of the people experience it.
The next question, for those that were impacted, either directly or indirectly, were you offered support? Just a yes or no in the Slido.
And I wonder from that, were you offered support, or whether a lot of it might have been no one thought to ask, or it just wasn't at the time or aware of it. I'd never even thought about being offered support at all.
That was interesting. Unfortunately, I was involved in 2 smaller incidences, one that was a bit bigger in 2019, where a car ran a red light and hit me. But, you know, I wasn't offered support, and it's really interesting how we all kind of react very differently, because the people in the other vehicle were very, you know, were talking and were quite loud, and I was just standing there in shock in my own head until I found out that it wasn't my fault. Someone had a visual of what had happened, and then I just kind of broke down afterwards. But again, even knowing what I know, you know, I hadn't been offered support at that time. And so our third question then, if you were offered support, what worked for you? So in the Slido, our slides seem to have been moving forward. In the Slido, just write down what your response was, what actually worked for you, and we'll see that come up in a cloud with different responses.
I guess the key here, sorry, Jim.
No, you go, Bernie.
Part of the key to this, or part of the important aspect of this question is, there's like I said before, there's no one size fits all approach to this. So whatever works for one person is what they should be doing. And some people don't need counselling, but it could be just talking, could be counselling, could be getting access to good information. And I keep saying that, so we talk a little bit more about that as we go along.
I guess for me, when I had my incident, I guess it was probably just calling up. I was on the as it was going on, just sharing with some friends and bouncing and family and that sort of stuff, and just talking through and that helped me sort of bounce through it. And then it sort of addressed the issue, but later on I think it's popped up a couple of times, but it was always just talking and sharing instead of bottling it up.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and just to share a personal experience, my son was involved in a crash about, it must be nearly 10 years ago, so he was a relatively young driver at the time, and I got a call saying, your son's been involved in a car crash, and his car had flipped but then landed on its wheels again. And interestingly, as I approached the scene, the traffic was banked back for miles, and all I could see up the hill that I had to run up, and I'm not a runner, was the ambulance and the police. So I could see the police and the ambulance and things, and I had to run up the hill. And I swear to this day, being in this industry, that the way the police officer managed me was part of the reason why I recovered so well and so quickly afterwards. He saw me coming. He must have made the assumption that I'm mum. He literally parted the traffic for me, so because he knew I was going to run straight across the road, and he gently just touched me on the cheek and he said, he's okay. And immediately the adrenaline started to dissipate. And from that point on, and this is what, in terms of offering support, he followed up with me the next day. He checked in with me and said, how you doing? How's your son? Those sorts of things. And from then on, and I already worked here, I guess that experience and how I was managed afterwards and the access that I had to support made such a difference. So everyone's experience is going to be different based on a whole lot of things.
And I think, just going back to those stats before these questions around truck drivers, we often, say that driving's a risk already, and the more that we're out on the roads, and so regardless of whether, if you're driving for work, you're just increasing the likelihood that you might be involved in an incident or be the first on the scene or a witness to an incident, as we've kind of talked about. So all those things can really have impacts on people, which Bern's going to go into in our next slide.
Just briefly, I noticed that one person said time, 20 plus years, and I guess that's something that we hear a lot from people who are bereaved as a result of that. Nothing is ever going to bring their loved ones back. Nothing's going to give them the life they've had before back, and people have been seriously injured as well. And sometimes it is time, and people learning to live their life around, for example, their grief, and find some sort of sense of meaning. So it can, like we said, be different things for different people.
And I think that's why our lived experience volunteers come to us to share their stories. It's really about giving purpose and meaning to the traumatic situation that they've been involved with. And, we hear lots of stories that people find it really difficult to talk to someone after they've been out, friends or family after an incident. And you hear stories where people even cross the roads because they don't know what to say. So for me, it's really about being there. You don't even have to have the words. It's just being there, knowing that somebody's kind of with you on that journey as well.
Thanks, Chris. So moving ahead, today we're going to be focusing on those people who are driving as part of their jobs, and heavy vehicle drivers are sort of that top tier, and there's so many different professions underneath that are on the roads every day. That's what they do. We're going to look at understanding trauma. We're looking at how to support someone who's had a traumatic incident. What skills and what can we all do, either in the workplace or personally, to keep our psychological well-being at a level where we can actually do a really good job at the work that we do and maintain a happy life. And when looking at the psychological effects of the work that we do, it's important to sort of start thinking about, well, what does a good day look like? And what are the challenges that you face? If anyone wants to contribute that their challenges in their roles, particularly around being a driver, please pop them into the chat and we can have a look at them. So we're looking at protecting your mental well-being. So what does that really mean? You know, when we look at road trauma and our mental well-being, we acknowledge that as a driver, you expect it to be challenging. We know that you're going to be working under tight schedules every day where you have to get from point A to point B and might have 10 stops and a limited time, and you've got to take your breaks. And there's so many things that impact your day in a way that can either make it stressful or make it pretty good. And also being influenced by what's going on the roads. Is it really busy traffic? Drivers seeming to be just driving really poorly on particular days, and those ongoing issues that happen every day. And as you mentioned before, Jerome, it's also the near misses. This happens every day for people who drive as part of their work. I'm happy to put my hand up. My husband's a truck driver, and I hear the stories every day of things that people do where the road sharing is just non-existent, and there appears to be this hierarchy at who should have the right of way. So also the witnessing incidents, all these things can actually have a massive impact on your mental health. So it's really important to look at all of those, not just one aspect. And also, if you're involved in a serious injury, a serious incident, depending on what support you're offered and information, can have a massive impact on your recovery trajectory. So we're looking at a little bit around that today as well. Oh, nope.
There we go.
Sorry, everyone, if it's a little clunky. Okay, so we're just going to have a little look at trauma. If you're involved or witness a serious incident, we know that traumatic stress from a road crash is one of the most common forms of stress in our community. It often changes a person's view of the world and their sense of safety and stability. So as a driver, if you witness a serious incident, let alone be involved in one, it could really shake up your confidence about being on the road. And like you said before, Jerome, about your example, that driver didn't drive for 4 years because the road all of a sudden was not a safe place. So it takes people sometimes a long time. And trauma can impact all aspects of functioning, both in the brain and the body. And we know that the brain and the body remembers trauma. So the uniqueness of each person's experience means that we need to tailor our responses and our support structures around what each person needs. And that falls within a broad range, I guess, of things that we, for example, here have in our toolkit, but can also fall into a broad range for a workplace. So trauma can impact our thinking, behaviour and moods, but it's really important to understand that reacting to trauma is not an issue in itself. It's a really normal response to an abnormal and distressing situation. And what people are trying to do in those early days, early hours after trauma, particularly if it's particularly distressing, is they try and make sense of what they've just been involved in or what they've seen, because it's not something that we're used to in our day-to-day life. So our brains are working overtime. And that's incredibly difficult when it just doesn't seem to fit within our lives. So understanding how trauma impacts us and being aware of what might help are the keys to people recovering. They'll never forget, but what we want for people down the track is for them to be able to remember the incident, because they'll always remember the incident, but with this not the same amount of emotional and psychological distress. That's the goal. And a really quick example is a woman I worked with many years ago when I was manager of counselling, had been involved in a horrific crash like 30 years before. And I said to her, what's prompted your call today? And she said there was a crash out the front of her place. and she heard it, and then she saw the ambos arrive, and it was the blue and white flashing lights that triggered her. And she said she was brought right back to where the incident was. And I said, what was it about the ambulance lights? And she said, and again, this is not having a go at all on emergency service workers. We have the utmost respect. But this poor emergency service worker said to her when he arrived at the scene, gee, lady, I thought I was going to have to put you in a body bag because of the state of the incident. Now, that person didn't mean to say anything that was detrimental or to cause concern. And it was a statement of more, thank goodness you're alive. But that's what triggered her. And that took her straight back. So her memories and her thought processes were still way back there. So she realised that she hadn't actually worked through it. I think an important thing to realise too within the workplace, and particularly in relation to how you structure your support for someone who's been in a road incident, is that what is not traumatic to one person could be to another. So, for example, as a supervisor in a workplace, what might not be traumatic to me might be traumatic to one of my drivers. And that could be dependent on a whole range of things that include things like previous incidents, what's going on in that person's life right now. You know, have they got any pre-existing mental health issues? What has the day been like before them or the week been like before them? So we can't make assumptions that just because I don't think this is a significant event, that my drivers aren't going to think that too. Yeah.
And I guess that's just because everyone's human. Everyone's sort of different in their own sort of way, and what our resilience, where we're at, like you were saying earlier, all those sort of things build together. And you have no idea. Everyone's different every single day.
Yeah, that's right. And what we bring into our day-to-day lives. And I remember Chris and I were getting to know a transport logistics company, and one of the health and safety reps said to us that he just happened to be on the dock one morning and he noticed one of his drivers who just kind of looked a bit off. And he said, you know, I went up to him and I said, you know, what's going on, mate? And he said, I just, you know, got a lot going on. And he said, had I not been on the dock that day, he said, I think about the what ifs, because he said he was not in a good place to drive. So, you know, if something had happened to that guy in that instance, you know, I guess there's so many implications of that. But one is, you know, what was he bringing in with him to his day at work? And I think that's a really important factor too. External
that's what I think too. And on that, Bernie, I was just thinking, like, it's Are You Okay? We have someone made the great call out about Are You Okay days this month and those sort of things going on. I think it's, and it doesn't have to be just one day of the year. It could be every sort of day as well, because it could just be such a life-changing moment when you do those sort of things.
Yeah, and you know, I think Chris and I both said how much we love working here, and I think one of the things that we're good at here is picking up on how people are. So if someone's not looking okay, we'll either call them after a meeting and say, you didn't call quite right, are you okay? And always putting our health, physical and mental health, before work. So,
and I think as colleagues, Ben, you know, we do know, you know, how people are normally. So if you start to see things that just don't seem like that person, just as I mentioned before, being there and just checking in can be a really valuable thing to also help, you know, make it okay to reach out for support, because there is still a lot of stigma about reaching out for support.
Yeah. And also external factors can play a huge part too in how people recover after trauma. And I'm going to use the example really briefly about media. If you're a heavy vehicle driver and you're involved in a crash, often the media will be inferring that it's the driver of the heavy vehicle's fault. And often that's the language that they use. And I'll give you a typical example is they'll say the truck plowed into the car, when in fact maybe the car pulled out in front of the truck, but it sounds like it was the truck driver's fault. What that does to truck drivers when they're trying to work on their own recovery, particularly if someone's been killed, is they're trying to process their own place in that crash. So they're often feeling guilt and shame when it wasn't their fault. So that's a lot of stuff to process in conjunction with the shock and the trauma responses that they're trying to work through. And I know, Jerome, you've done some work with the media over recent weeks, and there's an organisation in WA called Injury Matters, and they probably most closely align with Amber Community in terms of the services that they offer. And they have some great stuff on their website, but one of them is a document for the media about how to report crashes. And that can also be how the visual media, the TV stations and stuff report crashes, and the imagery that they show can massively re-traumatize people who have already been involved in an incident. And we work pretty closely with media here too to try and get them to understand that. So understanding the stresses in the workplace and understanding trauma and how it impacts people speaks to the importance of how supervisors and managers in the hierarchy, I guess, develop the appropriate skills and resources to support their employees. And Chris will look at that a bit later on, but it's about thinking broadly, and like I said before, be proactive instead of reactive, and have a broad range of skills and procedures in place to cater for different incidences. So it's about not making assumptions about how you think someone's going to be responding to a particular incident, but actually rather checking in and making an assessment and putting in the supports from that point on. Oh, sorry, I knew that was going to happen.
I think on this one, Bernie, as well, there's a few questions coming in. I'll just grab this one that came in now. I think it'll feed in to this and to where Chris is going coming up. But how do I get my employer to understand that trauma is real? They may not have experienced trauma at any level to properly understand. And now this is perfect when you look at the common reactions here. I thought it's a great segue as we lead into this.
Sure is. It's a great question. Depending on where you are, my first response is call us and we'll work out a time to speak to your employer. But I'll give you an example. So an ex-client of mine was involved in a horrific crash when a man decided to take his own life by driving into his truck. And that it was a horrific scene. So it wasn't his fault. His employer contacted me to actually understand, because he didn't understand this man's reactions to the trauma, because this person didn't want to get into the truck again. He was terrified to go very far. He didn't want to go on long distances. So part of what the education process was for this employer who reached out, which was a real positive, was to go through what are normal reactions to trauma. And this list that I've put up here is extensive, but it's certainly not exclusive. So there are more. It's a comprehensive list, but not exhaustive. So I think that what we've found often too is after a crash, people may feel some of these things, and things develop over time. And the common ones that happen first up are often the flashbacks and the nightmares, the startled responses, the insomnia, developing a fear of driving. For someone who's a professional, driving is a huge issue. It's not about just how am I going to pick up the kids from school or do the shopping. This is my livelihood. So trying to work on that driving phobia is massive. So we work with, I guess, all of this and depending on what people present with, and I guess too, depending on what they have already come in with pre-crash and pre-incident. And I think often people will deny or ignore the symptoms and think, pretend or just don't want them to be there, so they don't acknowledge them. And what can happen down the track is it's often family and friends who actually say, hey, listen, these are the things I've noticed. And that truck driver that I spoke about before, we reached out to him in the early days after that crash, and not surprisingly, he said to me, mate, I'm fine, I don't need any help. And I said, okay, well, here's our information. Go off and have a look at it. If you need us, we're here to call. We're here. And I did offer a call back, but he said no. And then 6 months later, I get a call from his wife, and she said, he's not okay. He's been detached from the family. He's agitated. He's having panic attacks when he's driving. So he engaged with me for counselling. And then eventually he got diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. We worked with him and his employer to slowly have a gradual return to work. And I'm happy to say he is back driving. But it took a long time. It took probably 3 years before he didn't get in the truck and every time think what's going to happen today, because he thought he was going to die. And there's a key point. So it's not just about what they see or what they're involved in. It's often about the what ifs. I thought I was going to die. So I guess looking too at what the stats Chris talked about before, a lot of people who are drivers as part of their work are going to witness serious incidents. Really important to acknowledge that these people are most likely going to have some or of these common reactions or different ones that may be, applicable to them at the time. It's really important to acknowledge that just because you're not directly involved in something doesn't mean you're not going to have a response to it. A lot of first on scene and witnesses will tell us, I don't understand why I'm responding this way. I wasn't in the crash. I think that there's a lot of examples that I could share, but I'm looking at the time that where people can actually need to just work through and get the education, the psychoeducation on what's normal. This is normal, what you're experiencing is normal, and work through with them. So I feel that it's really important for workplaces to acknowledge the incidences that drivers witness just as much as it is if they're directly involved in something. In your example, Jerome, of that guy who saw that little kid's face and then couldn't drive is a really good example, because the workplace could assume that, well, nothing happened, you'll be right. But he wasn't right. So it could be as simple as a phone call from a supervisor to check in, or it could be actually making sure that they get the relevant information and the follow-up. One-offs don't generally work. People need to have a plan in place and a protocol and procedure that's going to help them to have a standard and consistent approach is the key here, not ad hoc and not dependent on just one supervisor or manager's opinion on what should happen for different drivers. That way everybody makes sure no one slips through the cracks. So I'm going to hand over to Chris.
Oh, I think you're on mute, Chris.
Sorry, I had to cough and I put myself on mute. I've had a bit of a cold. Thanks, Bern. And I guess, following on from what Bern has just talked about and looking at the support following road trauma, I mean, the key thing that we've continued to say is, it's important to remember that everyone's different in what responses they might have, what signs and symptoms they might have, but also in the support that they might need, and why we need to think of what's going on behind in their lives before the crash as well, in thinking about what needs to happen. So it's really important to kind of recognise that not everybody wants counselling or needs counselling, and there's other options for support as well. So having that appropriate access to support and information can really minimise the risk of people falling through the cracks, as Bern just talked about, having those plans in place. So within the workplace, having some of those standard practices and industry-wide responses can help reduce the stigma. And, it was good when I saw that "Are you okay?" comment before, because, starting to look at ways that we can destigmatise support seeking help seeking is really important. That, you know, there's lots of fears that people have when they seek support, in that, you know, is this going to have an impact on me in the workplace? Am I going to be okay? Are people going to, you know, put me out of doing what I love to do as well? So it's really important to think about those kind of responses that we might have when people do seek support. So it's really creating that environment where people feel comfortable to speak up, to talk. As Bern mentioned, early access to appropriate material can be really important. It can help to validate and normalise what people are going through. If there's more of an understanding and awareness about, you know, what they're going through and the changes that might be happening, can help with getting the support that they need. Education, like what we're doing today, can be a really important aspect within the workplace in skilling up our people to understand what's going on for them, and that it's okay to reach out for that help. Normalises people's responses, and finding some strategies that might assist them in the workplace. So providing opportunities to share, I think I said before, just being there, you know, for me was really important. And I think it's so important for others. Just being there, you don't even need to have the conversation or the right words that we sometimes search for. Not everyone wants to talk about the incident straight after it happens, and it's not always helpful for that as well. You know, often we hear about people needing to debrief straight away, and it's actually not always the most helpful thing to do. But it is important when people want to talk and when they're ready to talk, to be able to provide that opportunity in a safe place where people feel safe to kind of talk about whatever it might be that comes up. Really kind of looking at what their existing support system might be can be a really good predictor of people's recovery. If they've got, you know, people around them that they feel supported by. So being able to check in and find out who they might be, and to link them in with people that can support them within their own support systems, but also within the workplace, and perhaps, you know, EAPs, psychologists, doctors can be one of the first point of calls to get the appropriate support, and, you know, obviously counselling if people are interested and that might be required. Suggest some referrals, like if somebody comes to you and having a list of people that you might be able to refer to can be a really good start. And there is information on our website, and a lot of the workplaces and EAPs will have a link of supports and referrals where people can do. So I guess what we do, you know, is really listen, hear from the person's perspective, and validate what they're going through. You know, that it is, as Bern was suggesting before, that it's a normal reaction to an abnormal event. So explain some of those reactions, normalise those reactions, and discuss those options for support. And I know, you know, a lot of people who might not have had counselling or reached out for support in the past might be really unsure and not know anything about what it is like to talk about personal stuff. So, you know, questions like, if an incident happens, you know, who do I talk to? Where do I ask? Where do I go to get that support? And having a workplace or an industry response to this can be a really good starter at all levels within the workplace. You know, what's important to discuss? You know, when people are worried about their driving and they might not want to drive anymore, how do they tell their boss? So there's lots of questions that often come up for people while they're trying to understand what they're going through. But it can be really important for us or other people in the workplace to kind of be aware of some of that fear that might be attached to that.
Chris,
sorry.
Chris, we've got a bit of a different sort of angle question that's come in as well, and I guess this is something that's going to come more and more to the forefront with the rise of technology. So we have cameras in our vehicles where someone in the office will see a very traumatic footage. Do you have any suggestions to help support these staff members? So you've almost seen it vicariously through the eyes of someone totally removed from an incident.
And I mean, that's something that happens quite often, and I think it's about being aware of that for ourselves, that these kind of visuals can be really can be traumatic for people to see. I know I was talking to a friend who works with in administration for Vic Police, and you know, she writes up a lot of reports, and pictures were attached to these reports, and it's like, wow, you know, I don't get paid enough to kind of see this. And it's like, once you've seen it, it's really hard to unsee that information as well. And, you know, one of the reasons that we don't show traumatic graphic information across our organisation, because it really can have a very similar or same impact on people. And Bern, you might like to add to that?
Yeah, I think it's such a good question. And the short answer is we actually do workplace wellbeing sessions around this very issue. So, for example, we work with insurance companies, with claim managers. We work with the TAC staff who take calls at the very first instance. You know, we not long ago did some work with a towing and transport company. I'm really looking at that vicarious trauma, or looking at, well, it's not even vicarious trauma if people are looking at the images. It's, you know, pretty much direct. But we look at that whole range of things, because educating the workplace, particularly around that, because sometimes they miss it. Sometimes they miss the fact that these people are witnessing really horrific incidents, all those near misses too, where, you know, you can just imagine someone looking through their fingers going, oh my God, what's going to happen? So I think it's a brilliant question. And I think the short answer is you need further education in the workplace.
Which is a perfect segue to this slide now, Chris.
It is, and I guess, you know, even though this is a dated graph, it really does model the different pathways that after an adverse event of trauma, and highlights the diversity of responses that we will support at Amber Community. But I guess, you know, our interest is really at that thriving end, that post-traumatic growth, and what promotes that, as well as some of the multiple negative and traumatic impacts of road trauma. And I guess really highlights, you know, the support that's needed, you know, after an event, that there needs to be that opportunity, because the trajectories that people can go on can have impacts across a community, within families. People can tend to go, you know, there's health and well-being, substance use, unemployment, a whole range of different aspects that we often don't think about. And when we think about some of these trajectories, and I can't move my slide, sorry, you know, some of those long-term impacts, if we don't kind of look at it early, can have ongoing impacts across a community. We know that, as Bern mentioned before, often we might go into a community to provide some information and to look at how a community can support each other after some serious incidences that have happened. You know, it is workplaces. Often, you know, we might not think about after the crash. You know, there's often lots of support, you know, for people directly impacted, but we often lose sight of what happens after the scene of the crash. You know, the impacts of road trauma on that injured person, then the emergency responses around them, the witnesses, those who aren't there, the families, the workplaces and communities that they return home to or not. And even just recently with the incident in Burke Street, you know, that has brought up a whole heap of stuff for different people back in 2017. So a lot of things can get accumulated. And I'm thinking of a story also that, you know, a young man, we actually run some programs in prison for people who have killed or seriously injured someone, and I remember in one of our first programs, a gentleman who had been involved in a serious incident when he was 18 in a country area, and being male, it was decided that he didn't contribute to the death of the person in the other car, that, you know, she had come out in front of him. But she died. He was there, first there to call the ambulances. He was there, you know, watching and seeing everything. And over time, you know, he used alcohol as a way of dealing with the emotions that he was going through. And people in his community, it was like, you know, what's your problem, mate? Get over it. It wasn't your fault. But he was left with a lot of stuff that he didn't get that support for. And, you know, that led into drugs and crime, and that's what took him into prison. But I know we were talking about it. He hadn't connected this incident to where he had gone in his journey. But he, you know, in talking to him, he was back there. You know, we could see that he was there, and we've been able to kind of work with him to go back to that scene and to, you know, deal with that. And he's in a much better place because he's been able to get the counselling and the support that he needed as well. So, you know, it is emotional, and the needs differ for all people, and road trauma doesn't stop after the crash. And it's really about how people put their lives back together.
Chris, I've got two questions I'm going to combine together, because I think that the second one's fantastic. So the first one is just a repeat. What was the number of lived peers support people again that you have? And then the second one is, how do I become a lived experience volunteer speaker, which is fantastic.
We have around 140 across the state. Not all of them are active all the time. We train and we support our lived experience speakers with every aspect of what they do. And we've had that researched and evaluated through Melbourne University, and we know that people's motivation to come into being a lived experience speaker is around wanting to make a difference and making sure that other people don't go through what they've gone through. And even if it's just one person that they can make a difference with, that's what gets them doing what they're doing. But what they get out of the whole process of becoming involved as a lived experience speaker is that it gives them some meaning and some purpose to the event. You know, some parents who have lost their children often say it's the only place that I can say my son's name out loud. So, you know, part of the healing journey that they go through is what keeps me where I am, because I watched that journey from where they're at when they first come to where they end up being is just inspiring. It's absolutely amazing. And people can just give us a call and say that they're wanting to get involved as a lived experience speaker. And one of my big mantras, I guess, is working at all levels from government, workplaces, using lived experience as a way to help with some of those decisions and solutions to what's going on in the space of road safety and particularly road trauma.
I'm very conscious of time, Jerome. How do you want to use the last couple of minutes?
Well, I think, and we had a driving instructor said, look, sees these things every day out on the road, distraction, it's important to give support, and it's a huge issue. I think just in the last sort of couple of minutes, I'd just like to acknowledge the amazing support that both of you do, and you give so much back to the community helping, and a lot of people overlook or forget about that impact afterwards. And I don't even think that whole issue of what ifs, that I was unaware of that to what we heard today. So we've gone through a lot of discussion. I'd like to close out with you two, just giving you each a chance to say what's your take-home point, like in 30 seconds. What would you like to say first, Bernie, and then Chris?
I think as an employer, I'd like to say that we need to take responsibility for looking after our staff. And for people who have been impacted by road trauma, the responses vary. So put something in place from a mental health wellbeing perspective if you're an employer of people who drive for a job. And for those people who have been personally impacted, the take home is if you need any support, please let us know.
Love it. Chris, you got to top that now.
And I guess for me, I've put it onto a slide, but, you know, to promote mindful driving practices, really encourage a culture of mindfulness around driving, providing resources or workshops on safe driving techniques, avoiding distraction and managing stress while on the road, leveraging lived experience and expertise, which I just talked about, you know, really collaborate with individuals and organisations that specialise in road trauma, and looking at the insights and experiences that lived experience can bring to the discussion within the workplace, the policies, procedures and all of that. And to promote a supportive environment, you know, fostering a workplace culture where employees feel comfortable discussing their experiences and seeking help if needed, encouraging open communication and showing empathy towards those affected by road incidences, and invest in training and education. You know, really consider that if in your work. So if something happened to me, you know, what would make a real difference to road safety and well-being within our workplace?
Wow. Well, absolutely fantastic. I was really proud to have you guys join us today. I think for everyone out there as well, you certainly see two amazing people in a fantastic organisation you could reach out to if you need support in any of these ways, and to help build your resilience before such an event takes place as well. So thank you both so much for your time, and thank you to our audience for sitting in today. Thank you to AFMA for kindly hosting it and helping promote it. So be safe and drive safe on the roads. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Hannah, do you just end?